All right, well, we will begin this session, and we are filming it. Actually, this will be available on the Marshall Anderson Rosenwald website afterward, and Ryan Phillips is going to edit it and have it available. This session, as you all know, relates to an exhibition that we had at Mars Hill University. My name is Les Reker, and I'm the director of the Rural Heritage Museum at Mars Hill. We put together an exhibition that had never been done before about rural schooling of African Americans, and particularly African American education in Western North Carolina, and particularly in Madison County, North Carolina, with an emphasis on the Mars Hill Anderson Rosenwald School. After the emancipation and after the Civil War, schools began to form for African American freed slaves and their children, but in Madison County, but they were very inadequate schools, lacking in real physical presence that could be conducive to learning for the most part. Supplies were limited, and even the teachers were rather limited for the children. Getting an education was really tough. And in fact, that was the way throughout the South. This particular school in Madison County, we thought of as a microcosm for all of North Carolina and really the whole South, and the way things transformed with regard to education. So in my beginning here, I want to tell you just a little bit about how this all came to be. And it really relates to, revolves around Booker T. Washington. And briefly, in his book Up From Slavery, he talks about the fact that he grew up a slave. And when he would carry the books of his master's daughter to school for her, he could see in the building, look in the windows and see all these children lined up learning and reading and so on and so forth. And basically he says, I want to do that. I know that learning to read will be something that will allow me to better myself and to live in the world and be productive and so on, be successful. But of course it was illegal for a slave to learn to read. In fact, in our exhibition we had stories related where slaves were beaten, little children were beaten if they dared look at a book in a master's house. And we have the actual, the first person talking about that. But as soon as emancipation came, he learned to read rather quickly. He was a very bright young man. And he was from Virginia, north of here, really. Not too, almost due north, actually, where he grew up. And he went to walk for a long distance to a school called the Hampton Institute in Virginia, near the coast. Became a star pupil there. The headmaster there took him under his wing, but he was a leader. Long story short, he eventually was able to be appointed to be the headmaster at the Tuskegee Institute in South Central Alabama, which is still there today, and it was basically became a college for teachers in African American schools, among other things. And he developed a platform there. He became actually, in the later part of the 19th century, early 20th century, the most influential African American educator the world had ever seen, really, and certainly in America. And he had a platform. He gave some very impressive speeches, and he was highly regarded in all camps, North and South and black and white. He developed a philosophy of education, particularly a vocational education for African Americans, as being the key to becoming middle class, contributing members of society. Although he didn't use those terms, that's exactly what he wanted to have happen, because there was no model for that for African Americans in America. There was no model to follow. How does an African American exist in America? Because their only existence before was as a slave. And so he became very famous. Along the same time, a gentleman living in Chicago heard about him. His name is Julius Rosenwald. Julius Rosenwald was the CEO of Sears Roebuck. He kind of evolved into that position. His brother-in-law actually brought him into the company, and Mr. Sears and Mr. Roebuck come on in, faded from the scene, and Rosenwald really took over the company. He was became quite a philanthropist, a Jewish man whose rabbi in Chicago really encouraged giving back, and he did, to many, many, many causes. He developed a foundation to which many, many people applied for funding. YMCA, I mean, Boys Scouts, lots of things. And we're talking early, he was born in the late 19th century, and so early 20th century, he was building Sears, Roebuck, from a very small company that kind of repaired cameras and watches and so on, and did some mail order, to the largest mail order and department store chain the world knew, especially in America. Became very wealthy. Someone gave him up from slavery, and he really liked the book. And eventually he met Booker T. Washington, and they became friends and partners. And Booker T. Washington convinced him, and it didn't take much convincing, that there was a great need in the South, the former Confederacy, for schools for African Americans, elementary schools for African Americans. And he shared Booker T. Washington's philosophy about vocational education as well as classical education for African Americans. So he said, how about helping me build some schools down here in Alabama for African American kids, elementary schools. And so he did. But as things evolved, they decided to develop a foundation to which school districts in the South could apply for funding and receive a partial funding, a grant, to build African American schools in their community. And so it happened. 5,300 schools were built in the South, which came to be called Rosenwald schools. Now we come to Mars Hill. Mars Hill is 50 miles south of here in Madison County, North Carolina. We're right on the border with Tennessee, in the mountains. Long history of slavery and discrimination and Ku Klux Klan and so on, to the Klan especially, a little bit to the east of Mars Hill, but in Mars Hill area, much more tolerant and livable, much more livable conditions for African Americans. And there were quite a few African American small schools. But the school district decided to apply to the Rosenwald Foundation to build a school there in Mars Hill. And they did in the late 1920s. And in 1928, a school opened on the same spot as this section called the Dry Ridge, the Long Ridge section of the county, and it was called the Long Ridge School. Then when they built it, they would call it the Long Ridge Colored School and so on. Eventually the name was the Long Ridge, was the Mars Hill Anderson Rosenwald School. So in 1928 until 1965, this school existed in Mars Hill, served over 2,000 students, brought them an incredible education that they would not have had otherwise. The alumni of the school, 3 of whom are with us today, have remarkable stories. Were it not for that education, the people who went there, especially those who went all 8 years, could not have flourished. Some went on to get PhDs, became community leaders, studied in California, New York, saw the world. That wouldn't have happened. But it did because of Rosenwald. Over 700 of these schools were built in North Carolina, more than any state. The Mars Hill Anderson Rosenwald School is the last remaining Rosenwald school in North Carolina, in Western North Carolina. Obviously, after '65, it's illegal to have a segregated school, so it doesn't function as a school. In fact, it is in its repair right now, and Ryan, one of my panelists here, will talk to you about the rehabilitation of the building. But it had a number of uses over the years, and it's still standing. It's the only one still standing in basically its original condition, deteriorated but original, and nothing's been done to it. So that's how we stand. And I'm very fortunate to have some wonderful people who have joined us today. We're going to tell you a little bit about their experiences there and their lives, beginning with Oralene Simmons on my far left. She'll speak about her studies at the school. She was there from 1949 to 1953. Her grandmother, Effie Anderson Kuhn, taught there in 1901. She taught at the colored school, the predecessor to the Rosenwald School. And she went on to study at the Stevens Lee High School in Asheville, which was the segregated high school in Asheville, some 10 miles away, basically 10 miles, I think. I don't know how the crow flies. Basically, they say, well, the only people that fly that way are crows. So it's windy. It's a long way to get down there. It was then, before the 26 was then. I have a number of things I want to talk about her, but it's really part of her spiel here. I will say she's the great-great-granddaughter of Joseph Anderson, who, she'll tell you how, but one of the founders of Mars Hill College. And actually it was called the French Pod Institute at that time in 1856. She went on, though. She has many awards and honors. She was presented the making of the King Holiday Award from Coretta Scott King and the Distinguished Service Award from Mars Hill College's Alumni Association. She's been on the cover of Time magazine, Jet magazine. She is the first African American to be accepted to Mars Hill College in 1961. And she went to the Rosenwald School. She has a long and storied history. And if you want to know anything about African American history in Mars Hill and Madison County, she's the person to go to. She has a wealth of information and interesting projects that she's doing right now. So I will turn it over now to Oralene Graves Simmons.
The Anderson Rosenwald School bears the name of my great-great-grandfather, Joseph Anderson. He was a former slave in Mars Hill, a person who was well-liked, respected, friend to many, a living Negro legend locally. This is one of the stories that connected me to the Long Ridge School and community that has attracted state and national attention. I grew up in Mars Hill. I would board the bus early in the morning that would take me to the Rosenwald School. On my way, we would pass by another school, but we couldn't stop at that school. We went to the school that did not have running water inside, nor indoor public facilities. We had to get in line with our coats on and travel down the hill to the outhouse. It wasn't a road, it wasn't a path. But we were able to get down there, and on the way back up, we would catch hold of the roots of the trees to go back up the hill, to walk to the water faucet outside that had cold water running in it, to wash our hands. We sat on the benches beneath the trees and enjoyed our bag lunch. Our books were the hand-me-down books that came from the other school. But we were very glad to get these books, even though they were tattered and torn. We washed them up, we covered them with brown paper and enjoyed reading them. One day after school, my grandmother told me that she was going to take me to see a play that was at Mars Hill College at the amphitheater. This was one of the only times that the people from the African American community go to the all-white school for a social event. I didn't quite understand the play. There was this white guy that had his face painted black, and that was on stage with paper chains, and this other guy was parading him back and forth, but I watched it anyway. And when I got home, I was just full of questions for my grandmother, and she told me, well, the student that you saw that was painted in black, that was your Grandpa Joseph. And I said, Grandpa Joseph? And she said, yes. And so she told me this story that had been handed down through oral tradition and found in the archives of how the slave that was named Joseph was owned by a Reverend J.W. Anderson, who was the future secretary of the Board of Trustees at the school. The school found themselves embarrassed when they did not have enough money to pay the contractor for erecting the building. And Joe was a very skilled brickmaker, and he had assisted the contractor with the building. They decided that they would take Joseph to jail and use him as security until the Board of Trustees could pay off the building. His imprisonment is the only time known where human flesh and blood went to prison for an institution. Remember I said he was well liked and well respected? Well, the money was collected in bits and pieces, and Joe was able to go back home to his family and his friends in Mars Hill. After the Civil War came freedom for Joe. His slave master gave him land for him and his family to live on. He was very interested in education for the African American students and became a member of the Mars Hill School Committee in 1865. And according to my grandmother, Effie Kuhn, he taught school in the Grapevine community. He sent her to school in Asheville so she could become a teacher, and she taught at the school in 1901. When he died in 1910, the Mars Hill Living Negro legend had passed away. He was buried in a family plot, but in 1930, to recognize his aid to the school, his remains were removed and buried on the campus at Mars Hill University. I was so sad to hear this story, but at the same time, I was encouraged. I'm going to go to that school one day. Now, why did I ever think that I could go to that school? It was an all-white school, and it was in the 50s. But I was going to go to that school anyway. I continued to ride the bus from Mars Hill to Asheville to complete my education at Stevens Lee High School. When it was time to make our selections of colleges that we wanted to attend, I just spoke right up and said, I'm going to Mars Hill College. My classmates looked at me, they looked at each other, they kind of sniggered and they kind of laughed and said, well, not just who does she think she is? She thinks she's going to go to that all-white school out there in that little sticky town where she came from. I said to myself, I'm Joseph Anderson's great-great-granddaughter. He helped build that school, and I'm going to go there one day. I submitted an application in 1961 and became their first African-American student. But there had to have been a special meeting and approval from the Board of Trustees to allow me to attend. And on my second time applying, I was able to attend the school. It was in the 1960s, in the heat of the Civil Rights Movement. And of course, when I got there, I received the message that you don't belong here. You're supposed to go to another school. And there was some word that they would call me on occasion that started with an N. I moved into Treat Dormitory, the dormitory that was in the center of the building. And am I running out here?
No, you're good.
Something came on by itself.
No.
It's a screensaver.
No.
The dormitory that I lived in was a small dormitory in the middle of the campus, supposedly for my protection. My bedroom window opened onto the porch that was right outside. Students would generally gather there in the evening, and I could always hear them talk about that student that lives in that room that doesn't belong here, and the threats of bricks coming through my window, and sometimes talking about we're going to drag her out and hang her from this big oak tree with this rope. And there was not anybody that I could tell. There was not anything that I could do. I just realized that I was a student there, and I was there to get an education. And I did let the other students that lived in the dormitory know that when I was ready to leave. That when I moved in, some of them moved out because they didn't want to stay under the same roof with a Negro. And for the others that stayed there, I told them that they probably had a different experience than they had ever had in their life because they got to sleep under the same roof with a Negro. That she was not your maid, she was not your janitor, she did not shine your shoes or make your bed. She was a student. She wanted a fair education and not her name on the welfare roll. And then I said, by the way, I'll be back next year and I'm going to bring somebody else with me. Because I knew if I was ever admitted to Mars Hill College, then other students would follow me. And one of those students just happened to have been my daughter. My daughter graduated from Mars Hill College in 1959. And in...
No, 1960.
I'm sorry. Thank you. I keep you mad. 1969, my daughter Nomura graduated, and then some years later, my granddaughter graduated. And in 1999, the Joseph Anderson and Jane Ray families, my family, were celebrated as one of the founding families of Mars Hill University. And we take our seats around the tables on Founders Day at the university. This is my connection. This is my story. I continue to tell this story for many people and in many groups. It is my story, and it is my place as well.
Thank you, Oralene.
Thank you.
There's living history here, folks. Living history. I would like to talk about our next two panelists who are going to do this jointly. Fatimah Shabazz and Omar McClain. They were two of the more than 2,000 students who attended the Mars Hill Anderson Rosenwald School. Ms. Shabazz's mother, Mary Wilson, taught at the school between 1939 and 1953, and she was actually her first teacher. She and Mr. McClain will discuss the challenges of living in an urban county, or somewhat. He's from Marshall, he's from Asheville, and coming to this school because there are some unique perspectives there that other of us would not have thought would have been challenges. I want to say Fatimah Shabazz is a broadcaster, a vocalist, percussionist, independent transformational facilitator, member of the Woman Song Chorus in Asheville. She's a native there, of course. Went to the school. She also went to Stevens Lee, Asheville High. She went on to attend school in California at the College of Alameda, also School of Fashion Design in San Francisco. Mr. McClain attended the school. He's originally from Marshall, which is a town not too far away today, but it was a long way away then with the roads. He served in the 82nd Airborne Division of the United States Army, was in the United States Army Band and the USO Band, performed, I believe you said, with Bob Hope?
Yes.
He was honorably discharged after tours of duty in Santo Domingo and Vietnam. He attended Queens College of the City University of New York and then worked in finance on Wall Street in New York and elsewhere. So I'm going to turn it over to Oralene Simmons and Omar McClain to relate your story. Or to Fatimah Shabazz and Omar McClain. I get it.
Excited.
Getting excited. Okay, Fatimah and Omar.
Thank you, Les.
You gonna, come on. Okay.
I'm gonna close your folder here, is that okay? Thank you all for coming today. I know there's a lot going on the campus. I'll just start right quick and jump right in. My mom, when she finished her, received her master's teacher's degree, she needed a job. And my dad, being from Madison County, knew that the school in Mars Hill was looking for a teacher. So he was the connecting force that brought her and the school together. So by the time I was 4 and a half, somewhere in their time frame, my mom started taking me to school with her. So I got in school a little earlier than most children. I do remember riding from Asheville in her car, and I think it was a Dodge because it always smelled like gasoline. We would ride this curvy highway, not the interstate, back and forth to school 5 days a week. Part of her process also was to pick up another teacher from Asheville, Mrs. Frances Owens, to make sure she could get to work every day. Miss Owens was my favorite teacher because every morning my mom picked her up, she would bring me a little carton of chocolate milk. And that would be my pacifier to ride to school. Now, one of the things I remember in particular about being in the classroom was the attentiveness that the teachers gave each student. And the way our building was designed, there were 4 grades on one side of the building and 4 grades on the other side. But each child was attended to. So she would give grades 1 an assignment, and they'd get started, and then she'd go to grade 2, those children, and do the same thing. And come back around, see if you needed help with anything. And just that's how she cruised through the classroom. So each child had the attention of the teachers. And I do remember the high importance for them to make sure that we were educated, thoroughly educated, not just in math and English and the usual educational, but how to be better people. So not just how to be a better person, but how to be able to write legible, those kinds of things. And my mom was very particular about the art. She loved the creative arts. She was also an awesome musician. So one of her focus also was to make sure that in addition to getting an education, that we also got to be creative. So we did plays almost every year or season or holiday. And we created our own costumes along with the community and parents and so forth. And we would throw this big play, and the whole community would come. They would open up the building where it was divided at first. They would open it up, and it would be one big room, and it would be full of people, and we put on our plays. That was my favorite part, in addition to recess.
Okay. As was mentioned before, my name is Omar McClain. I was from Marshall, North Carolina, which is about 10 miles from Mars Hill, as the crow flies again. But one of the first things that kind of stands out in my mind was the travel. Okay, because they had one little bus that would come from Mars Hill and sweep down through Marshall to the end and come back through and pick up each student and bring them off to school. And then do the same thing in the afternoon to take you back. So this added maybe another 45 minutes to what would normally be a school day on each side. Okay, the other thing was that I always got a sense of the community being more involved in our care than just as a teacher. Because for me, even though I was from Marshall, a great many of my relatives were living in the Marshall area, so that if you had to get disciplined, it didn't have to wait till your mother came home. One of the relatives would take that into consideration. The other thing was that when we went to school, we didn't have the advantage of like today with preschool or kindergarten. It was just straight out, you know. Most of us were fortunate at the time that our parents served as that preschool or kindergarten prior to going there, and did a very good job, as I can say for my own self. I was one of those people too that was able to go to school early. I went to school at age 4, which was kind of a curse and a blessing at the same time. Because one of the things that my preschooling at home did for me was that I didn't have much to learn when I went to school because I knew it all. So now at age 4, to be able to sit and be quiet while the other kids learned was quite a task. But anyway, I persevered. And I always look back upon that as the foundation of everything for me. Because it not only taught me how to, the basics of education, but how to deal with other people. To understand that it's not about me, it's about the whole institution here as Marshall. I'll never forget that.
Yeah. And we both had the opportunity to attend Stephensley as well as Oralene, and I don't know if you know the history of Stephensley High School. It is phenomenal. But for me, I think you mentioned the disciplinary aspect of it, and I think that was high key. That, again, is not to just be educated, but to be a well-rounded student, to be a well-rounded person. And I guess they knew too that from their own experiences, if we don't educate these children, they're not going to be able to make it in the world. So they went beyond just teaching the class. They went beyond that. Discipline was handled in the classroom. I mean, you didn't mess up, you didn't act out. If you did, you sit in the corner, whatever, get spanked with a bowler bat. Also, too, we realized, too, that some of the people in the area class, each child, because we had a pot-belly stove, that's how our room was heated on each side. Each side of the class had a pot-belly stove. And one child was designated to get into the school just a little earlier to start the fire. So the school room would be warm by the time all the kids came. One of my dad's cousins, that was his responsibility to fire the pot-belly stove. So I remember the plays, as I mentioned before, which was a highlight for me, but I really, and I look at old pictures, seeing the room so full of the community. And as Omar mentioned, half of them were his family. So it was that cohesiveness that kind of stuck for the children's education as well as for the community and the well-being of future generations, which we were in that process of being that future generation. So in gratitude for those teachers, in gratitude for Dr. Washington, and in gratitude for Mr. Rosenwald for stepping up to create such a phenomenal aspect in the educational world of children of color. I am just overwhelmed with the fact that I had an opportunity to go to a school with humble beginnings, but with such a powerful history. So from that space, I say thank you.
Well, one of the other things that resonates with me in particular, being from Marshall, they didn't have a lot of black families in Marshall at the time. And I quickly learned that if I wanted to escape that type of situation, it would be through these books. And I said to myself, this is the way I'm going to get out. Wasn't a talented athlete, so that wasn't an option. So it was either the books or not.
Yeah.
So I applied myself in that area. And just like you said, look, I went there from 1950 to 54, and then went on to Hill Street. And then Hill Street was a black elementary school in Asheville. By that time, we had moved to Asheville. And I started there in 55, and then I later went on to Stevens Lee. And it was quite an experience. And I thank you all for listening.
Yeah, thank you for coming.
We will have time for questions in just a bit. I want to fill in, they both talked, since we have a minute, talked about Stevens Lee High School, and they were known for having a tremendous education for African Americans. It was the only African American high school in Asheville, but one of the best bands in the state, evidently, and everybody came out to see it.
Yes.
And one thing that you didn't quite mention there, I want to emphasize, is that when they give these plays every year at the Rosenwald School, the entire community turned out. The white and black community turned out. There weren't that many black families. And so it was a really nice, cohesive family affair, really, with everybody coming to see the plays.
I'd like to add one thing too that we didn't mention. You would think in that time frame that there would be that separation of the whites and the blacks, but in that particular community, there was that cohesiveness. If you needed and I had it, it happened. And that kind of followed through with the education.
Right, it did, and Oralene has some twists on that she can add to what that relates, because you actually lived in Mars Hill, and so there was that. And we can get to that afterward. I wanted to, since you were quick with your presentation, have a story to throw in here, since you were mentioning Stevens Lee. In the 1940s, there was a woman living in Mars Hill who had 9 children. Then her husband died. Her name was Viola King Barnett. And she had to support her children as a domestic, taking in laundry, whatever she could do as an African-American woman, raising a big family. Her children went to the Rosenwald School. Her oldest children made it through there, and she had some relatives in Asheville who they stayed with so they could go to the Stevens Lee High School, because you were later there and car travel was a little bit more prevalent. She didn't have a car, and it was a really windy road to get down to Asheville. So they just lived down there. When the next ones came along, there was no relatives left for her to have them stay with. And so the state of North Carolina required that you go to school till you were 16. So they repeated the 8th grade over and over and over. And it's pretty awful. And she had 7 more kids to go through here. So she said, you know, this isn't fair. My kids can't get down there. There was no African-American high school in Madison County. None in the whole county. They had to go to Asheville. And so she was encouraged by members of the faculty and staff of Mars Hill College to write a letter to the superintendent of schools in the state of North Carolina. This is documented in several books about African Americans in North Carolina. She wrote to him and explained her predicament. I live up here in Madison County. There's no high school here. They're required to go to school till they're 16, and I can't get them down there. And the superintendent wrote back, I think pretty quickly, and said, you're right. I'm paraphrasing. You're right. Your children should be able to go to the high school. And so because of your letter, all children in the state of North Carolina will now receive transportation to high school. Black and white. Because actually the white kids didn't get transportation either, but they were close to a high school, or closer. And so she's a real, she's called a real pioneer in black education in North Carolina. Her grandson is one of our football coaches, and he's also a minister. And I just heard you say you sold your house to him, or your land to him, Oralene. I didn't know that. But that's a very interesting, a little tidbit I thought you might enjoy about this whole educational experience and how education was very, very important in Marseille for African Americans and for the whole region there, because as he said, that's how you got out of here and did something. My next presenter is Ryan Phillips. And Ryan is a native of Mars Hill. He went to Mars Hill College, actually. He's a cultural historian of Southern Appalachia. He's also a photographer and videographer and owner of the Legacy Films Limited Company. He's a filmmaker. He serves on the planning committee of the Friends of the Mars Hill Anderson Rosenwald School. And he will talk to you about, before we go to questions, about the rehabilitation of the building and what this committee is attempting to do with it. So Ryan.
I will talk briefly about the rehabilitation project, but before I do, I would like to show a short video that will pretty much catch you up to speed on a lot of what we've already talked about and the rehabilitation project.
And you might want to move this way. It's hard to see from over there.
I hope everybody can see. Yeah, sorry about that.
During the early 20th century, blacks, especially rural Southern blacks, were not allowed to attend the same schools as whites. As a result, they were not afforded the same educational opportunities and experiences as their white counterparts. Discrimination and segregation meant that black schools were in horrendous condition, dilapidated, without heat or running water. Booker T. Washington, a former slave, author, and politician, decided to take a stand. Washington believed that education offered the only promise for immediate improvements in the lives of Southern black Americans. He believed that Northern philanthropists would share and support his vision. Julius Rosenwald, the Sears Roebuck magnate, was that generous philanthropist. And together they created a matching grant program to build schools. Rosenwald's financial investments were matched by the local black community and the white school board, where together they created not only a succession of school buildings, but cooperation between black and white rural Southerners. These schools were called Rosenwald schools. In the early 1930s, there were more than 5,300 Rosenwald schools in 15 states, more than 800 in North Carolina alone. In fact, more were built in North Carolina than any other state. One of these schools is the Long Ridge Anderson School. Built in 1930 in the Mars Hill community, the school is nestled in the heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains. What remains of the building today stands as a monument and a reminder of the struggle for equal rights for all humankind. The Anderson Rosenwald School was a gathering place for the local community, as well as school with classes up to the 8th grade. More than 2,000 children attended the Anderson Rosenwald School before it was closed in 1964. The Anderson School is one of the few Rosenwald schools remaining in the mountains of North Carolina. While the building still stands, it is in desperate need of repair.
Speaking of the opportunities, they are far greater today than they were at the time that I was back in elementary school. There's so many things that you can do, so many opportunities that are afforded to young people today that were not afforded to me at that time.
One of the stories that I would like to tell is how this school got its name. the Anderson Elementary School. And it comes from in the 1850s, Morrisville College was built 1 mile from this schoolhouse. And the first building was built by contractors out of Asheville laying the bricks. But when the school was finished, the school still owed the contractor $1,100 to start Morrisville College in 1856. So they did not have the money. And they went into litigation, the contractors trying to get their money. There was no hard cash to be had. The contractors in Asheville, when the sheriff from Buncombe County came and levied against the Board of Trustees for that debt the college owed them. And since they could not get the money, they levied against one of the trustees and took one of his young slaves and put him in jail in Asheville as collateral for this debt. That slave's name was Joseph Anderson, for whom the Anderson School is named. Within a few days, the local families raised the money and set Joe free from the jail in Asheville, coming home to his wife and 3 children. Joe lived out his life in this community and was greatly honored by those who knew him. In the 1930s, Morrisville College wanted to honor Joe further and asked permission of his family to remove his remains from a local cemetery and bury him on the campus at Morrisville College. He is now interred on the college campus. Also, the college in 1999 realized that his sacrifice was the school was equal to any of the founding family members, and so the college named the Joseph Anderson family as one of the founding families of Morrisville College. So today that story gets repeated within this community, and it's no wonder they wanted to name their school Joseph Anderson.
Just had a real nice time out there with all the kids who went to school with. A lot of them are gone now, but there's still a lot of them still around. But we basically formed a good camaraderie of friends and in time sticking together. And other than that, Anderson Elementary is one of the key points in my life.
When we went to school, when we got books, we always got the cast-off books with the pages missing, and they would be torn and worn, and sometimes you could hardly read them because, you know, they were so used and come to pieces because the backs would come out. When I went to school, I didn't know what I wanted to do. All I wanted to do, I know, was go somewhere and get a job. And I ended up in retailing. In New York. And I like that. And even today, I still like to sell stuff.
Like I loved math. And then the recess, when we go out and play different games, and like for the home play baseball. We played baseball. We had dodgeball, hopscotch, mostly for the girls, hopscotch, and hide and seek. We played that, and I enjoyed the school years when I was in elementary school. I really did.
If you had the potential, it still couldn't be fully developed because there were not facilities whereas the blacks could utilize as they can today. How does the saying go? A mind is a terrible thing to waste.
This is the only black school remaining in our school district. As a matter of fact, several years ago, we had approximately 60 schools spread across the hollows and valleys and mountains of Madison County. And through the years, through consolidation, many of those schools have been closed, and many of them have been lost. We're very fortunate that this one still remains. And since it's located here in this community, we feel like that we really need to do everything that we can to preserve it, to renovate it, rehabilitate it, and have it available for students today that attend our schools to come visit, for people who live here in this community to several prominent people as presidents, possibly Henry Ford and some of the other people that have visited this school. So a site such as this certainly ought to be preserved.
These Rosenwald schools are vestiges of an important chapter in philanthropy and the education of Black Americans in the South. They demonstrate the strong community ties forged by Blacks who were determined to educate their children against all odds. Today we are called to action to preserve not only these schools, but also that legacy of community cooperation. We need your help. Please make your donation today to help us match foundation and corporate grants, just like the Marsville community did 90 years ago, and preserve this building as a monument and reminder of rural Black heritage and the Black educational experience in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina.
As you can see, the school is in pretty bad shape. So about 5 years ago, a group of individuals in the Marsville community got together and decided to develop a plan to rehabilitate this building. Basically came up with two main goals. These two goals are to rehabilitate the building as close to the original design as possible. We're working very closely with the Department of Cultural Resources in order to be placed on the National Register of Historic Places. And in order to be placed on the National Register, you have got to have it back to its original design or as closely as possible. So we're working very hard on that. The other goal is to preserve the structure and educate the local community about the historical significance of the African American School. It is a historical landmark, it really is. It's the last one standing in all of Western North Carolina. We're very proud to say that. In order to be placed on this historical register, it comes with a little price tag. So if you'll turn to page 3 inside of your brochure, you will see that we're in need of several items to complete this. We're well on our way to completing this. We've already have the roof done, and we're in the process of having the shell rehabilitated. But the windows and things of that nature are extremely expensive. So if you're anybody you know would be interested in helping us, please feel free to let them know. And please take this with you. We have our contact information on here. We have the website on the front, email address. If you're in the Mars Hill area and you want to come to a meeting, please do. We would be honored to have you at the meeting. And also, we're on Facebook. So if you happen to be on Facebook one day, please think of us and click on our page. It is I believe it says Rosenwald Committee, Anderson Rosenwald Committee like page. Please like our page. And we update it as much as possible and try to keep people up to date on what we're doing and things of that nature. So that pretty much does it. Thank you, Les.
That film was produced by Elam University as a documentary, and I think they did a really good job because it does pull it all together with this school. We're a little early, so that's good. I can talk a lot. But I want you to some questions here. But I want a few things yet about this school. The Rosenwald schools, Rosenwald and his foundation, if you applied for funding, he gave you about 1/3 of the money you needed. So the school district had to come up with 1/3 of the money, and the community also either provided labor or materials for the school. They provided plans for the school. So Rosenwald schools all look alike. There are, however, are many variations on the basic plan, and we used number 20 in Mars Hill. Basically, they had it designed by the best minds that existed in America because it was Sears. And designers and people who knew, and architects. They had a bank of building windows on one side, if you notice. They all have that. So that the classroom would be fully illuminated, but there wouldn't be a glare by having them compete, and the teacher wouldn't have the sun in her eyes. They carefully positioned the building. The colors on the inside, they had a buff color, not unlike this, a little bit more yellowish, and a very pleasant kind of blue-green color that they had on wainscoting that went around. So it was very pleasant, had a blackboard, chalkboard at the front. This one was divided into two parts, as they said, so grades 1 through 4 and 5 through 8 divided between the two with a potbelly stove on each side. You saw in the photograph, some of those were actually of the Rosenwald School in Mars Hill. In the 1950s, water was finally brought to the school, and it was there for Oralene when she was there, and of course Fatimah and Omar, but before that there was no water. And so it was really, there was no restrooms either, and she talked about they had first 1 and then 2 privies. As it happens, the older women that was sitting on the, actually both of those women there were sisters in the video. Their cousins, they had 3 of their cousins died when they went to school because of contaminated water they got in the spring that they filled their bucket with for the school. And we're not sure where the source was, but it was probably from everybody's privies and so on. But the restrooms were put in the 1950s, 1955. We know for sure because we had the sink in our exhibition, and it was emblazoned on the sink, 1955. And so, but those restrooms were not part of the plan, so they were removed a couple years, last year before, and it's to return it to its original look. Some of the Rosenwald schools were bigger, some even had 2 stories. Some white communities adopted Rosenwald plans throughout the South. They purchased them. But they're not considered a Rosenwald school if they didn't have this whole setup where it was a school district and the community applied for funds from the Rosenwald Foundation for African American students to go to elementary school. That's a true Rosenwald school. There are the records of the Rosenwald Foundation are being kept at Fisk University, and you can check with them online. They have all the records of all the schools as best they can. There's also a Rosenwald organization, and their annual meeting is going to be in Durham in June. Okay, we're ready for questions. Yes, sir, you were first.
First of all, I want to thank you for your presentations and sharing with your stories. I appreciate it very much. I'm thinking about presentation, okay, of what you're doing in there. I'm Native American, and we had boarding schools, and we were put in boarding schools to take the Indian out of the Indian. That meant culture and language, okay? But many of the same things are shared. I think you guys would flourish regardless of where you were and what you did. Resilience. You know, I prefer talking about culture because in Appalachia, there's white people that share the same culture based upon living in the landscape. And there's lessons in surviving in that landscape. It's not all about race, black or white. I see a differentiation between black education and education of blacks. Because I think black education, from my perspective, would be more about the culture and what you learn from living in the landscape. But I think explaining that would be useful for understanding. Your culture, your life is important, and sharing that with other people help them understand who you are as a people.
Thank you. Very good. Anybody would like to respond to him? Fatima?
No,
Yeah.
I think. Go
Go
ahead.
ahead. You're absolutely on point with that. And even though I don't recall hearing anyone say, we're going to teach you about your culture. I don't recall hearing that. But I'm feeling that that was a concept that our teachers had because they came up and they knew what their parents and their grandparents had experienced. So in order to hold some format of African American culture, they delivered that information to us in a different way. You know, it's not like you're black and you should know how to do this. We didn't get that. What we did get is an overall focus on being educated by any means necessary, and the theater and the plays and those kinds of things where we got to show our culturalness, if you will. In addition, not just black culture, but culture. I remember reading Shakespeare, if you can believe that, and acting out different characters. So I think the concept for my mom in particular was to broaden our awarenesses as much as we could, as much as they could, in addition to the books, but in addition, and that, on top of that, the arts, which is culture. So, thank you.
Well,
May I respond to that?
Yeah.
Excuse me.
okay. I'd like to add a thing to this. I too am part Native American on my mother's side, so I understand all this wholeheartedly. The problem, as I saw it, was that the school system failed to recognize the importance, even in the texts books. It's like if we didn't have any part in the development or structure of the society, as it were. I had to do all this on my own, you know, and I went about it, you know, very vigilantly, specifically on the Native American side, because as growing up, a lot of my ancestors, like almost were ashamed of the Native American side. I came along and I was just the opposite. You know, I embraced it, you know, 100%. So that's where I'm at with that.
Oralene?
Yeah, I wanted to add to that. Yes, as Omar mentioned, the books that we read from, they were all white narratives. And it was something that we kind of accepted, you know. We had never seen anything different. But in the segregated schools, we did get to learn Black history. Mm-hmm. It was taught to us by our Black teachers. We learned the Negro National Anthem. But when the schools were integrated, the schools in Asheville, probably the same in Mars Hill, those Black schools closed, and those kids were bused to the white schools, and they did not get to learn Black history there because those teachers followed their curriculum, and so many of the Black teachers lost their jobs because they weren't going to be sent to the white schools to teach white children. Some of them did, some of them, so many of them did not. But now, when they went to the integrated high school, they were able to study Black history, but it was as an elective subject. It was not required. And now in so many of the colleges and universities, African American history is a very popular subject. And so many of the college students are now studying it. What's a new horizon? It's something different, you know. We're not talking about discovering America here. But I know that my grandson in particular that's at Greensboro. He has decided this was going to be his major, and he is just surprised that I can hold these conversations with him where other people cannot, because I grew up in the area where it was taught to me in elementary school and in high school, and he did not. So he loves talking to me when he comes home. But so many of the students, and I'm glad to know that so many of the students are now studying African American studies and African American history at colleges and universities. It's a new horizon.
Thank you. I think we had a question over here.
I just wanted to start. I'm so excited to hear from you today. Ms. Simmons, I've known your story for many years, and it's just an honor to meet you. I graduated from Lee Edwards in 1966.
Wow.
Oh,
1966.
Yeah, right. You're on the cusp.
So you know about Stevens Lee then?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. In fact, I've been interviewing my mother, who was on the grand jury. She drew jury duty one year, and it was the year that they were inspecting all the schools, and she went to Stevens Lee and wrote a scathing report, called the Board of Education chair, and said, "I'm going to turn this in because the conditions were so inadequate at the highest at Stevens Lee, but it had such an outstanding reputation." Stevens Lee, of course, I was, as far as my research on Asheville, was the sort of cultural center, and had a real direct link with City University of New York. No, it was Queens College in New York.
Right, that's where he was.
And he would come down.
Yeah.
He wrote it. And he would come down and do presentations at Stevens Lee each year. I've been doing research since for some years on the Allen School in Asheville, which was a Methodist
All girls.
boarding school for African American girls, and intrigued. And Allen School worked with Yancey County when they desegregated their schools, and the parents in Yancey County boycotted the schools because of the condition for a period, and so Allen School and Stevens Lee took in the high school children from Yancey County that became us. But the thing that intrigues me is the rigor of the education that we were receiving and the parental support, and the extent that in many cases children from really rural places were propelled out of the South into New York City, to California. And I just, I find that just astonishing.
It's an additional part of this story that just simply we're telling now. And we didn't know, and so many things are part of the popular culture that are just simply not quite correct.
Well, to me, I've been writing about this right now because the color line in Asheville is so formidable. For a white student at Lee Edwards, I had no idea what was going on there. And it's such a tragedy.
Well, I'd like to say about Stevens Lee, where you talked about the type of report that was turned in about all of these infractions and things. We had all
the physical conditions.
Yeah, but the students and the faculty there had all of the pride and dignity in the world.
Yes.
They were just made it the greatest, and we were just so lifted up that we couldn't even see those things because there was another path that was over it. And we still have the Stevens Lee alumni. And so many people come from across the nation to those alumni association socials because they're still so very much connected in there, and love that history and love each other so much.
And it's interesting too that we're so at ease traveling. I mean, going to New York City.
Yeah.
You know, that's a
Well,
scary place.
One of the
Well,
things too,
go ahead.
that we realized with our teachers at Simmons, we all had masters.
Right.
And when they integrated the school, there were two things were going to happen. They were going to cut and pay, which many of them chose not to. And so they retired or just, it's not position yet or lower position. And, to be dishonored as educators at that time was something that they just chose not to do. So, as you say, with the flow. I came out in 66 as well, but I came out from the Hughes School on French Broad, which was actually Southridge Broad School. Yeah. So our class was the first one to, we graduated as integrated class. Yeah. So, yeah.
I went to grade school right after immigration, so I was one of I benefited from that in the sense that my fifth grade teacher would have been formerly the principal at the Black High School.
See?
And, for me, it was wonderful, not so much for him, because he was regarded as very disrespectful of his parents and his background, his education, his capabilities. But it was wonderful for me, and I had my sixth grade social studies teacher also came from Black High School and infused that history that everybody else had been missing into my education. In fact, when I got my first job, she called me up, kind of read me the right act and said, "I know you'll do the right thing. I taught you the right thing," And that stuck with me all my life. But the one thing that I'm impressed with is that integration of education and community, and I think that has broader implications because right now I'm working with an after-school program in a former company town. These are, we have some Mexican-American children, but for the most part these are all white kids, but very disconnected to their history. Consolidation of schools, they're bussed in, and there are a lot of financial, economic, other problems. But those kids don't have that sense of pride that you're talking about. It's fostered by having their community reinforce who they are. And they go in and they get lost in this sea of, and I guess I'm looking for some how we reintegrate, community and family into our school system.
Well, when they say it takes a village, no doubt, no question, we have lost the village. We've lost my personal opinion, is we have lost control of raising our kids in life. We can't discipline them without being disciplined ourselves. Something's wrong with that picture. So when a 4-year-old child tells you that they're going to call police on you for taking their phone, something's wrong with them. So
well, that's what happened now.
We lost that. And I, as an adult, get to take responsibility for making some choices in my earlier years, in my 20s or whatever, feeling that I wanted to continue on with my life, get a higher paying job, get a better education. And in order for me to do that as a woman, I'm stepping out of my home to do that. And so the man's already out doing his duty. And mom steps out. Who handles the kids? We lost them. We lost them. So as an adult, I get to be responsible for the situation that we're experiencing today with our children. I don't know the answer. I really don't. I wish there was an answer.
We've reached the end of our time, but we can take, he's got a question.
If somebody else has one, I'd really talk, but if not.
Do you have a question?
Well, this is so interesting because I studied at desegregation schools in a little rural county in northwestern Chesapeake County. They had a Rosenwald school as well, but a very different experience because it was so rural, whereas, Asheville is.
It's pretty rural.
Our school was pretty rural.
It's in the middle of the mountains,
I guess what I'm interested in is, because I am fascinated that you had
or to go to Marshall College. I think with the predominantly white community, sort of like what you're saying, that I work with there in Chattooga County, those kids don't have that encouragement. What do you think? Do you think it was something to do with your parents? Was it to do, because some of you left your home community, right, to go to the school?
Oh, we all did. We all did.
What gave you that sense of security or the courage to go out?
We knew that we were going to have to leave that area in order to get a job, as our aunts and uncles and cousins and everybody else had. It was just something we knew. It was just something we accepted, and many times it was going to another city where you might have had relatives or family or something. And of course, we were already accustomed to riding the bus, so it was just get a ticket and go. And when I mentioned the thing about family, I know that my aunt, my mother's sister, left Marsville with a $5 bill and went to Cincinnati to live with her aunt. And it was like so many other people followed her from the Marsville area to Cincinnati, because that was one place where they could go. They were across that line, that Mason-Dixon line, and before we knew it, we had like 200 family members in Cincinnati.
In Marcel, and all of Madison County, you saw part of the great northern migration of African Americans. And you talked about Cincinnati is a big destination, but also Detroit, New York, and actually Charity Ray, who talked about going to New York, she only came back because her parents were ill and she had to come back and care for them. Otherwise, and her sister was sitting next to her, was in Virginia as an accountant. I mean, they were living real productive lives, but then there's a whole other issue of elder care and so on. But I want to thank my panel very much for participating, and for you to come. Thank you so much.